Buenas noches, good evening. Yo me llamo Gloria, mis pronombres son ella y estoy aquí con mi cointérprete Joel, que también usa pronombres ella. Good evening, my name is Gloria. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm here with my co-interpreter Joel, who also uses they, them pronouns. Esta noche tenemos el privilegio de proporcionar interpretación simultánea del inglés al español y eso significa que vamos a estar usando unos aparatitos y también creando un espacio multilingüe juntos. Tonight we have the privilege of providing simultaneous interpretation for this event from English to Spanish. This means that we're going to be using some equipment and that we're also going to be co-creating a multilingual space together. Para eso, les queremos compartir a ustedes unas pautas para que nos ayuden a crear este espacio multilingüe. So for that, we want to share with you some guidelines that you can help us with to create a multilingual space together. Primero, quiero decirles que a veces cuando estamos hablando nos emocionamos mucho y empezamos a hablar súper rápido porque nos apasiona mucho nuestro tema. Si eso pasa y nosotros, los intérpretes, no podemos captar todo el mensaje, les vamos a hacer esta señal para indicarles que por favor hablen un poco más despacio o un paso más moderado. Les vamos a pedir que si ustedes en la audiencia nos ven hacer esta señal, que lo hagan con nosotros también para que la persona que está hablando tome nota. Entonces, si por favor, ahorita las personas que me entienden pueden hacer esta señal porque va a ser una gran práctica para el evento. Gracias. So I want to start off with that sometimes when we start speaking, we get super excited and we start speaking super fast because we're so passionate about the topic that we're talking about. And if that happens and us, the interpreters, can't catch the entire message, we're going to do this sign to indicate to the speaker to please speak slower or more of a moderate pace. If you see us doing this sign, we're going to ask you, the audience members, to please do it with us so the person who's speaking can take note. So I'm asking you all now to please participate and do this with me. Thank you. Hay otras veces que las personas están un poquito más penosas y empiezan como que a murmurar un poquito y así y no se les entiende. Y si eso pasa, nosotros haremos esta señal para indicarles a las personas que proyecten su voz y que hablen un poquito más alto o claramente al micrófono. Sometimes people are a little bit more shy and they start kind of murmuring and talking like this and we can't really understand them. And if that's the case and we can't really hear you, then we're going to be doing this sign to indicate to the people to please speak louder or more into the mic. De nuevo, si ustedes nos ven hacer esta señal, les vamos a pedir que lo hagan con nosotros. Again, if you see us doing this sign, we're going to ask you to please do it with us. So if we could just all do it again. Gracias. Y lo podemos hacer todos juntos. Muchas gracias. La otra cosa que es importante recordar es que nosotros, los intérpretes, solamente podemos interpretar una voz a la vez y no queremos privilegiar una voz sobre la otra. Entonces, les vamos a pedir que por favor tengan en cuenta cuando una persona esté hablando y no hablar sobre otra persona. Another thing that I wanted to say is that we can only, as interpreters, interpret for one person at a time, and we don't want to privilege one voice over the other. So if someone is speaking, please take that into consideration and don't speak over the person because we don't want to pick and choose which voice to privilege. Si necesitamos hacer un recordatorio sobre esto o tenemos que tomar una pausa, nosotros como intérpretes haremos esta señal. Igual les vamos a pedir a ustedes en la audiencia que la hagan con nosotros para que la persona tome nota. If we need to make a pause or if we need to remind folks of some of the guidelines, we interpreters are going to be doing this. And again, if you see us do this, we're going to ask you to please do it with us so the people that are speaking can take note. Una cosa también es importante recordar que las personas que escuchan la interpretación van a escuchar el mensaje unos segundos un poco más tarde. Entonces, igual, cuando interpretamos del inglés al español, las palabras pueden extenderse como un 20%. Entonces, les vamos a pedir que cuando hagan una pregunta o estén cambiando de ponentes, que por favor tomen una pausa. Una de las maneras que ustedes pueden insertar esa pausa mientras están hablando es respirar y contar hasta 3. Esto va a ayudar a nosotros a marcar la diferencia en las voces cuando estemos interpretando, porque recuerden que las personas de la audiencia, solamente las personas que están escuchando la interpretación van a escuchar solamente a Joel y a mi voz. And so the other thing that we wanted to mention is that for simultaneous interpretation, the people that are listening to that are going to get that message a few seconds later. In addition to that, Spanish tends to be 20% longer than English. And so we are going to ask that when you ask a question or you are switching speakers, to please take a pause. You know, one way to insert that kind of pause is by breathing and counting to 3. That way, we interpreters can mark that pause and ensure that the listeners who are listening to our interpretation can also mark that pause for themselves. Because remember, the folks that are listening to the interpretation are only listening to Joel's and my voice. Y bueno, con eso nosotros vamos a estar alrededor de aquí. Si hay alguna pregunta, por favor no duden en comunicarse con la persona que no está en el micrófono. And with that, Joel and myself are going to be around interpreting. If you have any questions at all whatsoever, please reach out to the person who is not currently on microphone interpreting. Y la última cosa que quisiera decir es que la justicia del lenguaje también se trata de la accesibilidad. Estamos muy felices de poder estar en este evento porque muchas de las veces la accesibilidad y también como que sobrepasa o no toma en cuenta las personas o las comunidades marginadas que no necesariamente tienen alguna discapacidad física, pero que también no pueden acceder a muchos de estos tipos de espacios debido a que no dominan el lenguaje dominante, que en el caso de hoy sería el inglés. The other thing that I wanted to just mention before closing is that language justice is also an accessibility issue. Oftentimes, we overlook that fact because we think about accessibility as an issue that deals with people of disabilities. But we also want to extend that to the marginalized communities who don't always have access to these spaces because of the language, because they don't speak the dominant language, which in this case is English. So we welcome this practice and thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening to the Rose Auditorium. I'm Hayley Eber, the Acting Dean of the ONS Channon School of Architecture here at the Cooper Union. I'll keep my remarks brief. I will try to speak slowly and loudly, but there's not much I can do about the accent. I will pass the floor on to Jacob Moore shortly, who's the director of the Architecture League, for a more comprehensive introduction to the program. However, I'd like to just articulate a couple of points. It is noteworthy that the Cooper Union is hosting an event focused on institutions with a solid commitment to diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. The Cooper Union was founded in 1859 on the fundamental principle that a free and best education should be accessible to all members of society, regardless of gender, race, religion, and economic status. Conceived initially as a free school for the working class, Peter Cooper took a revolutionary step by welcoming both men and women. Notably, Cooper Union did not impose a color bar. The enduring dedication to diversity and inclusion defines Cooper as the vibrant community it is today. And speaking of accessibility, I would be remiss not to mention a fun fact. At the time of construction, the foundation building across the street was technologically innovative. It was the tallest building in New York City at the time, and it had the first elevator shaft before the advent of the elevator. Peter Cooper anticipated that the elevator would be invented. He articulated the state of building practices at a time serving as a model of how a future accessible New York City could be constructed. Tonight's program, Making the Inclusive Museum, aims to contribute to the ongoing conversation about numerous art museums in the United States that have demonstrated their commitment to DEAI. I want to thank Joel Sanders and Seth Cho and their firms MIXdesign, whose research undergirds this initiative. And special thanks to the Architecture League for shaping this program and for their ongoing partnership with the Cooper Union for the current work lecture series. We eagerly anticipate hosting more lectures this spring on the theme of accessibility. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Jacob Moore. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayley. Thank you all for coming. I'm Jacob Moore. I'm the Executive Director of the Architectural League as of September, so it's really exciting to be here and to be welcoming you to tonight's event. Before we begin, we're really grateful to the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, in partnership with the City Council, and the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, without whom tonight wouldn't be possible. And before we get into the program, I just want to make sure everyone's feeling okay. Is the volume loud enough on the mic here? The temperature hopefully is working all right, good. So tonight, as has been mentioned, is co-organized by the Architectural League and JSA MIXdesign and hosted by the Cooper Union. So I'm just going to ask anyone from those institutions who's been involved with tonight to raise your hands. You're probably most down there. Okay, there we go. Scattered around a little bit. First, I want to say, again, thank you to all of you, especially to Anne Rieselbach, Zoe Fruchter, Joel Sanders, and Seb Che. I'm so grateful for everyone, for everything you've done to make tonight happen. It's been a lot of work that predates my arrival at the League, certainly, and it's really exciting to be at this point. And for everyone else, if you had somebody near you raise a hand, now you know. If there's anything that we could be doing throughout the course of the evening to make your experience of the event more comfortable, let us know. So before introducing tonight's presenters, a few words of context. Since well before the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed in 1990, ensuring physical accessibility has been a mandate for design professionals in the United States. Nonetheless, ableism remains a pernicious force in the built environment today and in the fields that are charged with its planning, design, construction, and management. Combating this inequity in practice means thinking both critically about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as insisting that we think beyond it, toward a horizon of disability justice. Especially here on the ancestral homelands of the Lenape people, combating ableism in practice means acknowledging the ways in which colonial powers, in history and in the present, here and around the world, have persistently sought to disable their colonial subjects through the techniques of settlement. It means better understanding how the inaccessibility of public spaces is linked with the persistent erasure of disabled bodies in public. It means studying the ableist intersections between financial thresholds and aesthetic protocols. And it means taking seriously what is known as the social model of disability, wherein society, as built, is understood as the disabling agent rather than the medicalized, isolated individual body. One might think of the often cited example of a building without a ramp being the quote-unquote problem in the social model, rather than a body that isn't able to easily ascend or descend stairs. One might also think of the convoluted healthcare system that has allowed for more than 3/4 of the US population to become sick with COVID as more to blame for the pandemic than any one individual's particular susceptibility to the virus. This spring at the Architectural League, we're centering the theme of disability justice in a few different ways. We have a number, as Haley alluded to, we have a number of exciting partnerships in the works that I hope I'm going to be able to report more on soon. Before I get to current work that Haley mentioned, including we're hoping to set up a institutional accessibility audit that will involve some outside partners and a few other things that I'll report back on as soon as I'm able. And then, as Haley mentioned, our current work lecture series is honing in on access as a frame. Over the next several months, we'll be hearing from design practitioners about recent projects that exemplify access as both a goal and a way of working, thinking through a few typologies, including libraries here at Cooper, but across the way in the Great Hall on March 13th, schools, also here at Cooper and in this very room on April 23rd, right, Anne? Yeah. And housing, virtual gathering spaces, and then, of course, tonight's subject at hand, art museums, which in their simultaneously convocational, inspirational, and educational modes are replete with both challenges and opportunities in the realm of access. For all of this, including this evening's event, we at the Architectural League approach this topic humbly. There will forever be so much to learn, and we hope to always build structures that not only invite input, but that actively facilitate it. If we can understand disability justice as a horizon line toward which we're heading, then we must also understand the access work pushing us ahead as precisely that, work, where collaboration, credit, and compensation are key. In that spirit, we're so grateful to Gloria and Joel, who you've heard from this evening already, who are shepherding the interpretation. Oh, and I forgot to ask too, are the devices working well for interpretation? I hope we're in good shape. Yes, I heard a yes. There you go. Thanks. And then also want to thank everybody at Cooper who's managing the tech and security, helping with cleanup. Also the team at the League and Beyond that's working on the video that we're going to be producing after this that will be available online so everyone can watch who wasn't able to join here in the room today. Or if any of you want to watch again, you'll be more than welcome. So many thanks to them. All right, so now I'm going to introduce tonight's speakers who each in their own institutional and individual ways have been working on this topic for some time and from whom we have much to learn. I'm going to introduce everyone now. We're going to have 2 short lectures back to back first, followed by a panel discussion, but I'm going to give every introduction now so that we don't have to sort of do back and forth. So first, our 2 lecturers. Joel Sanders is founder and principal of JSA MIXdesign. A professor at Yale School of Architecture and School of Public Health, Sanders teaches classes examining the intersection of architecture, inclusivity beyond code compliance, and mental and physical health. He's the recipient of the Fashion Institute of Technology's 2023 Lawrence Israel Prize. Seb Che is the associate director of JSA MIXdesign, where they lead staff and collaborators on inclusive design initiatives. Che's practice includes music, performance, and writing, which has been published in Pinup Magazine, Do Not Research, and books including Queer Spaces, an Atlas of LGBTQ Places, and Out in Architecture. So following the 2 lectures, we'll have a panel discussion with Kiana Hendrick, who's the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Access at Brooklyn Museum. A cultural strategist and educator, her writing has appeared in the Journal of Museum Education and the Palgrave Handbook of Race and Arts in Education. Maria Nicanor is the Director of Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. An architecture and design curator and historian, Nicanor previously held positions at the Rice Design Alliance, Norman Foster Foundation, and Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. Daima Simmons is an educator and arts worker focused on collaborating with artists to develop spaces for marginalized communities to create, commune, and gain access to critical resources. She's currently the Director of Social Impact at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Sally Talent is the President and Executive Director of the Queens Museum, New York. She was previously the director of the Liverpool Biennial from 2011 to 2019. And in 2018, she was awarded an OBE for services to the arts in the Queen's Birthday Honors List. This conversation will be moderated by Ignacio G. Galan, an assistant professor of architecture at Barnard College and Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. An architect and historian, Galan's scholarship focuses on architecture's role in processes of inclusion and exclusion. So, that's everyone involved over the course of the evening, but we'll kick it off with Joel Sanders, who's going to join us now. So thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And before we jump in, I'm going to add to a few more thank yous, both to Haley Eber here at Cooper, and also I just want to extend again my thanks to the staff of the League. The planning of this event began nearly 2 years ago. We've been working with Ann Rieselbach, who of course is here, as well as the League's former executive director, Rosalie Ginevro, one of also my oldest friends, who is here. Thank you, Rosalie. And then Rosalie then passed the baton to Jacob Moore, the League's new director. And so if my experience, our experience, is a reliable indicator, I can guarantee you that he will be a collaborative, empathetic, and visionary leader of this venerable institution for years to come. And I also want to thank Zoe Fruchter, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly, Daniel Chofie, Alicia Botero, Billy Kiley, and Ann Carlisle for their hard work. And also want to say that sponsoring tonight's event is just one example of how beginning with you, Rosalie, okay, and Anne, the League has been a supporter of, first of all, my work, and it's been 38 years, dare we date ourselves in our friendship. So thank you very much. Okay, so tonight is an opportunity for us to share research conducted by what we call the MIXmuseum Initiative. It's a design research project that we launched in 2018, dedicated to collaborating with partner museums, some of whom you'll meet tonight, to generate design recommendations for making museums better meet the underserved needs of the diverse audiences who have traditionally not attended art museums. However, before Seb will sort of share our research, I want to situate this contemporary, as we've heard tonight, DEAI initiative within a broader socio-historical context. So since the advent of what many scholars think was the first purpose-built picture gallery still extant in the Uffizi in Florence, this was 1584, human bodies have posed a problem for art museums. These first private palace museums made possible a conception of what I refer to as the kind of ideal humanist spectator that invited aristocrats to visually commune with paintings and sculptures, as well as each other, as depicted in this image, by looking at what was then a new invention, framed perspectival images hung floor to ceiling in sumptuous ornamented rooms like these. And in keeping with the perspectival theory of Alberti, a Renaissance scholar at that time, an architect, spectatorship was, and I think it still often is, considered an out-of-body optical experience. The spectator's eye is invited to take leave of the corporal body, situated in the actual space of the gallery, pass through the border defined by the picture frame, and enter pictorial space through visual identification. And this conception of spectatorship posits a museum viewer who was in essence a disembodied eye. In this scenario, looking at art perpetuates the age-old Western opposition between mind and matter, spirit and flesh. Vision, often referred to as the master sense, and I use that word master specifically in its horrible connotation, is affiliated with immaterial intellect, as opposed to the body, the earthly container of the soul, subject to temptation and to desire. However, this humanist ideal of disembodied spectatorship posed a new dilemma with the emergence of the first public museums in 19th century Europe and America. The agenda of institutions like the National Gallery in London, which opened in 1838, was to educate citizens of all classes by exposing them to the great works of art that were previously seen or only accessible to a privileged elite in these private palace museums. And this mandate presented the first museum administrators with a challenge, not so different from what many museums face today: crowd control. Records kept by exasperated museum staff in the 19th century describe people pushing, shouting, and even dining in packed galleries. According to Thomas Unwins, the keeper of the National Gallery in London, said, "When I admonished a group of country people not to partake of meat and drink, they good-humoredly offered me a glass of gin." So driven by this need to protect and conserve priceless masterworks, designers were enlisted to invent tactics that would transform the unruly public into well-behaved, respectable citizens. And so for the first time, paintings were hung less densely in narrative formats organized by national schools. Guardrails were installed to encourage viewers to circulate around the edge or on the perimeter of the room at a safe distance from works of art. And the freestanding chairs and easels, commonly found in private galleries, now obstructed traffic flow. And they were removed and replaced by fixed, they were comfortable couches, but still marooned in the center of the gallery. Now let's fast forward. 20th century, the advent of the white cube as the optimal environment to display modern art only exacerbated the eye-body problem. Although the white cube is generally considered a Bauhaus invention, it became a museum standard with the opening of MoMA, MoMA's International Style Building in 1939. But by the post-war years, with the rise particularly of movements like abstract expressionism and later minimalism, the white cube established itself as the dominant gallery type that prevails today. It was and is still considered to be a kind of to be the suitable standard or environment for the display of large, frameless abstract paintings and sculptures, now often without their pedestals. So at first glance, the austere white walls, ceiling, and wood floor of the white cube, it seemed like a radical alternative to that kind of richly decorated 19th century gallery found in the 19th century museum. But nevertheless, the white cube, like its 19th century counterpart, gave spatial expression to Western art's ongoing investment in perpetuating what I've described as the fiction of disembodied spectatorship. Influential post-war critics, particularly Clement Greenberg, championed what was essentially a classical conception of spectatorship. He described viewing abstract pictures as an instantaneous optical experience, which he compared to the speed of a baseball pitch. And so again, architecture, or architects and designers were enlisted to transform, again, the potentially unruly viewer into obedient, disembodied eye. The track light placed out of sight on the ceiling replaced the obtrusive guardrail. It now distributes a band of light around the perimeter of the gallery wall and floor that situates the body at a prescribed viewing distance, usually 3 to 4 feet from works of art. So, in other words, track lights, at least subliminally, demarcate a circulation zone of looking but not touching. In addition, white cube designers take great pains to conceal visually distracting reminders of our physical selves. That includes mechanical grills that circulate climate-controlled air and exit signs for life safety. Also, gallery design reflects the museum's, I'm being polite, ambivalence about the eyes that watch you while you look, both human and electronic. Surveillance cameras are placed way high up on walls out of view. Security guards, often people of color, hide in plain sight. Although they wear kind of uniforms denoting their authority, the layout of galleries do not generally make room for their presence, forcing them to awkwardly stand in vacant corners or the threshold between rooms. And by the way, I've spent a lot of time just watching guards. Not pretty. The same could be said for the bench, a concession to the biological body, prone to fatigue that threatens to visually distract from works of art. Sometimes they're even confused with works of art, minimal sculpture, as well as obstructing circulation. But now that sort of comfortable couch in the middle of the 19th century gallery has been reinterpreted as this sort of hard, almost like a pew in a church, right? Just a flat, uncomfortable plane with skinny legs, if you can find them in galleries at all. So in short, despite their stylistic differences, the 19th century gallery and the 20th century right cube, I would argue, both respond to a common problem that has become even more acute today. How to design museums that reconcile what I still think is a prevalent ideal of this disembodied, autonomous viewer, free to optically commune with great works of art, okay, with the actual reality of embodied visitors who threaten to touch, damage, and even steal vulnerable works of art. So if accommodating embodied spectators at the museum has posed a problem for museum administrators, curators, and designers for well over 400 years, today their job is made even more complicated by the emergence of DEAI initiatives, again, whose goal is to attract underrepresented minority audiences that museums have traditionally overlooked. Not new, again, this issue again needs to be considered in its historical context. At least since the 1960s, 3 generations of feminist, queer, Black, and artists with disabilities, from Carolyn Schneeman to Bazira Khan, from Felix Gonzalez Torres to Salman Tour, from David Hammonds to Simone Lee, from Frida Kahlo to Park MacArthur, just the tip of the iceberg. But they all have made and continue to create provocative works that call into question heteronormativity, whiteness, and ableism. And in a similar vein, art historians like Linda Nochlin and curators like Thelma Golden have, again, exposed, highlighted, and also attempted to dismantle what has been a systematic refusal of art museums up until recently to collect and display works by minority communities. Critiques of the white male gaze have demonstrated how gallery architecture is complicit in this erasure, referring to examples of Old Master and post-impressionist paintings from Titian's Venus to Manet's Olympia, recently on view in the Met, if you were lucky enough to see it. Theorists have described how pictures reproduce dominant assumptions about race, class, and gender in at least two ways. First, by content, what we look at. The narrative content of the image contained within the frame, which quite literally here objectifies women and also BIPOC communities, okay, and offering them up as objects of scrutiny, of delectation for a white male gaze. But second, through the spatial dynamics of spectatorship, how we look, visual art, paintings and sculptures, as well as photographs and videos, working in conjunction with what I call the apparatus of display, the design of the galleries themselves, typically invite embodied viewers, no matter their actual race, gender, or ability, to identify with the point of view of the image, which by default presumes and assumes and constructs, and I think that's important, and constructs a spectator who is able-bodied, cisgendered, straight, white, and male. So over the past 2 decades, museums have been pressured to absorb the lessons of institutional critique advanced by artists and critics, at least since the 1960s, through, again, diversity, equity, and access initiatives, whose goal is, again, to reverse statistics like these that show that museum attendance in the US is still overwhelmingly white and middle class. And in 2020, these initiatives were further accelerated by the pandemic and racial justice movements like Black Lives Matter. So in their effort to diversify their audiences, museums have worked hard. They're investing in a variety of social equity measures. They include human resources, recruiting minority curators, administrators, and board members, curatorial practices, mounting exhibitions that showcase the work and experience of underrepresented artists, including BIPOC and LGBTQ+ and disabled artists. In addition, and I generalize here, some people will disagree, but they're sponsoring programs, often, I think what they might disagree, I'm saying they're programs geared to people with sensory disabilities. I think they're often sponsored by education departments or people who manage visitor experience. So these include ASL tours for deaf people, tactile tours for blind people, and sensory-friendly hours for artistic people. And this is great. It's a step in the right direction. However, our research shows that these programs, although terrific, tend to isolate people with so-called special needs in activities that don't allow them to mix with other museum visitors. And in addition, museums are also beginning to generate guidelines that go beyond code compliance. And more often than not, they take the form of accessibility guidelines for gallery spaces. And the focus has been on galleries, okay, that again, importantly, target people with physical and sensory disabilities. And most importantly, they include the Smithsonian Guidelines for Accessible Exhibition Design of 2010. And in addition, organizations like Art Beyond Sight, the Museum Arts and Culture Access Consortium distribute resources describing accessible programming and staff practices to accommodate disabled visitors. But in addition to these practices, which are important, I want to turn the attention to sort of, let's say, my profession and what I was taught to be, architects, okay? And I would argue that since the early 2000s, that museum architects have tended to focus their energies on strategies to counteract the intimidating impression of museum buildings, both classical and modern, that are thought to be off-putting or intimidating to the so-called average building. And the dominant trend, which I personally am quite critical of, has been to remove existing opaque masonry facades and replace them with transparent, light permeable glass facades that, like retail shop windows, are intended to welcome people off the street and invite them to enter into these spectacular lobbies, often conceived of as multi-purpose atriums, now activated by adjacent cafes and shops. And these spaces are often used for galas, special events, and also, because museums have to raise money, they become rental opportunities. And again, although well-intentioned, okay, I like my fellow architects generally, these prevailing design approaches, I think, still fall short. In the end, they still presume a normative visitor. So in response, in 2018, JSA MIXdesign launched the MIXmuseum initiative that we will share with you this evening. And we've been developing a toolkit consisting of design recommendations that aim to transform galleries, as well as key public spaces that shape the visitor's arrival and entry experience. Again, into accessible, inclusive spaces that sort of follow our mantra, our namesake, MIXdesign, that allow people of different ages, genders, races, religions, and abilities to mix together in public space. And our research operates across scales and disciplines, thinking about the role of architecture, interiors, exhibition design, graphic design, and landscape play in shaping the visitor's experience. And so rather than come up with interventions that are building specific, we propose generic solutions that could be adapted and implemented by a wide range of institutions on a case-by-case basis. And the toolkit is the outcome of research that has taken, that has been conducted with a variety of constituents that we refer to as the MIXmuseum Network. They include, they're represented here, advisors, just so you think we're credible, okay? We've conducted lots and lots of interviews with generous colleagues from art museums like the Frye Museum, Yale Center for British Art, the V&A, Oslo National Museum. We've worked with design advocates like the Center for Curatorial Leadership, Arts and Culture Access Consortium, and of course, the Architecture League. And we're also designers, and we've worked in the capacity as designers on projects for the Yale University Art Gallery, their renovation, the National Museum of Stockholm's reinstallation, and recently on an invited competition, which we lost for the Dallas Museum of Art, but it offered us a lot of research. And we've also been lucky enough to work as inclusive design consultants for the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego. And now, and some of our friends are here tonight, we're doing working with Norman Foster and partners on as inclusive design consultants for the San Diego Museum of Art. And they're doing it right because they're not doing a post-occupancy assessment, but they're doing it even before they design. So, but also we've worked with research partners with grants from the IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the NEA. And this allowed us to partner with the Queens Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, the Cooper Hewitt, and the Whitney on a 2-year research project, which focuses not so much on galleries, which have gotten a lot of attention, although important, and we do that, but on the non-gallery public spaces. And representatives from all of these partner museums will be at the panel that concludes tonight's events. So just to finish up, our work, MIXdesign's work, and MIXmuseum's work is based on a series of design principles which build upon but differentiate themselves from the important foundation laid by the ADA, established in 1990. First, rather than narrowly focus on people with physical or sensory disabilities, we consider the intersecting needs of this Venn diagram of disability, people with physical and sensory disabilities, neurodiversity, autism. We think about different body types, okay? Heights, weights, sizes, and age. We think about religion. Particularly, we have representatives on our team who are practicing Muslims and also Jews. And we think about culture, race, as well as language. And of course, where we began, or at least maybe where I began, thinking about gender trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming people. You can see that on the chart. Also, we offer an alternative to the separate but equal model characteristic of most accessibility standards. They're great, but they tend to prescribe physical accommodations that's like separate ramps or separate entrances, which perhaps unintentionally segregate and in the end stigmatize those people, again, with special needs. And so our goal for the Mix Museum and in general at Mix is to enable our mantra, the maximum number of differently embodied and identified people to interact in different settings. However, we recognize that there are different ways of being different that don't allow for one-size-fits-all solutions. And for this reason, our designs provide for some people and communities with unique functional and privacy needs that do require separate accommodation. And finally, Mix offers an alternative to the top-down approach that I was taught many, many years ago when I graduated from architecture school, exemplified by the heroic modern architect, or today's architect, who, and I think it's changing, I know it's changing, but has more often than not, up until recently, been a celebrated white male genius whose vision, God forbid, would be compromised by the input of a client or a user. And so instead, we follow the disability rights motto, nothing about us without us. Inclusive design depends on the active participation and engagement of users who provide valuable insight from their lived experience of the designed environment. So now I'd like to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Seb Chet, who will share our MIXmuseum Toolkit findings, which I say ours, but are the product of, again, the many, many different people, our network, who gave us the input that we based on.
Thanks for being here, everyone. I love that slide that compares me to the white male genius. You know, that's like, glad that's not going to be me. Thank you for being here. Honored to be on this platform with you in person. Some extra thank yous to our amazing team at JSA MIXdesign. Camille and Matthew are in the crowd with us. Nate helped so much with this presentation and the rest of our amazing collaborators. So also thank you to the League for supporting this work for so long. Before I dive into our findings from this initiative, I want to share a bit about our participatory design process, which we believe is equally important to design recommendations. As Joel shared, we've worked with different museums over the years, including the ones pictured here, but tonight I'm going to highlight our process with Queen's Museum as an example of a participatory design process that we hope can be broadly applicable. In 2019, we began to collaborate with Queen's, a museum with a track record of serving a diverse community and a building that's undergone many changes, but most recently, a renovation that we felt was representative of some of the challenges that other museums were facing at the time. With grants from Yale Architecture and Public Health, it allowed us to work with a few key staff members as well as graduate students to conduct what we called a pilot study, implementing a 3-step process pictured here to understand how different visitor groups can perform different activities at different places in the museum. In 2020, we used this pilot study to successfully apply for a 2-year grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which allowed us to expand this process and build out a more substantial team composed of members from our office, the Queen's Museum staff, and Queen's Community House, our nonprofit partner, as well as Yale graduate students, many of whom are here tonight. Super happy that you guys could be here. And we met bi-weekly for 2 years. Can't stress enough how much of a team effort this was, especially as we retooled our project on the fly to safely meet requirements imposed by the pandemic. And though this diagram doesn't capture everyone, many of them are here tonight and just want to thank you so much for contributing to this effort. Pictured here are some of the engagement tools that we used throughout these 2 years, adapted from methodologies in architecture and public health, like co-design and community-based participatory research. I'll briefly walk through some of these tools now. First, we conducted a literature review with our public health expert, Abigail Ganader, to assemble an 80-page report analyzing over 150 peer-reviewed articles to really understand and get a clear picture of the access barriers faced by different marginalized user groups in museums and how museums were working to accommodate those people at the time. We then designed surveys to solicit feedback from individuals familiar with the Queen's Museum building. We sent out an online survey to all Queen's Museum staff members, as well as to their entire email list. This was supplemented with an in-person station pictured here, which was available throughout the length of the project. This resulted in over 200 survey responses for us to analyze. We also offered 8 professional development trainings for all Queen's Museum staff, acknowledging that accessibility cannot be achieved by design alone, and that it's essential to invest resources in offering opportunities to become literate in best practices and access. Trainings covered topics like alt text, language justice, autism awareness, and deaf culture. We also needed to acknowledge that art museums are not static, and their use varies at different times of day, activated with programs of different sizes. We knew that there's a large audience of people who have never visited the museum in the first place, perhaps because of the access barriers that we wanted to address. So for this reason, a major part of the project was offering 12 free public programs geared towards the diverse audiences we wanted to attract. So this meant building partnerships with local organizations to create bespoke one-time events tailored to specific audiences. For example, an oral history workshop for older Spanish-speaking adults, or a DJ workshop for queer and trans teens. These events allowed us to bring these diverse audiences into the building and then ask them to complete surveys to understand any access barriers they might have faced, as well as their ideas for recommendations. And while the previous tools allowed us to cast a very broad net, we also wanted more depth. So perhaps the most important tool was recruiting the access cohort, several of which members are here tonight, composed of 27 Queens residents representing a cross-section of the museum's audience. They were paid to work with us over 2 years as experts of their own lived experience and was as diverse as the borough of Queens itself, including native Spanish speakers, deaf people, trans folks, wheelchair users, and parents with young children. So the access cohort worked with us in a 3-step process of different kinds of meetings. We conducted guided walkthroughs to identify access barriers in the building. We conducted co-design workshops where we got together with markers, trace paper, and clay to create sketches and models to generate design proposals to address these barriers. And finally, we worked with students from Yale Architecture and Public Health to create scale drawings and renderings of these sketches. Then the students could present this back to the access cohort for feedback and critique, revise, and then represent. So this generated hundreds of creative, out-of-the-box ideas. I could gush about these sketches and models for hours. They were incredibly inventive, but I can't capture them all here. But hopefully this animation gets the idea across. If you're interested in more details, we recently published a 100-page report chronicling this process and its findings, which are publicly accessible on Queen's Museum's website. So that was an example of the process that we hope can be generalizable and useful to other museums. Now we're going to share findings not just from Queen's, but synthesized from the different museums we've worked with over the years. And I'll also note that while our toolkit does include recommendations for gallery spaces, tonight we're going to focus on non-gallery museum spaces, which have not been as well researched. Before I guide us through some of the different activities and spaces that make up the visitor experience, I want to share some common challenges that permeate almost all museum spaces. They include physical access and usability, information, circulation and wayfinding, wellness, and atmosphere, each of which I'll address as they show up in different spaces. For each museum activity, we've organized our findings into barriers and recommendations, and we'll show examples of different museums, but it's important to know we're not trying to single anyone out. We really just want to illustrate common issues that we found across many different museums. So let's start with arriving to the front doors of the museum. Getting outside. Barriers to arriving outside of the museum is exemplified by some of the sites pictured here from our museum partners, but allow me to zoom in to one example, the San Diego Museum of Art. First is physical access. Museum entries oftentimes split stairs and ramps apart, and the latter can be challenging to find because of its distance from the main entry path and minimal directional signage. In worst cases, there's a separate ADA entrance altogether, creating a separate route that stigmatizes visitors and separates them from the crowd. Here we recommend one barrier-free shared route that everyone can use. Ideally, this should avoid level changes like stairs and ramps, but if it's inevitable, we recommend a ramp that's wide enough for a pair of wheelchair users or deaf visitors who communicate laterally through American Sign Language to navigate together. Something we also hear over and over again is that visitors aren't aware that the San Diego Museum building is actually a museum in the first place, whether that's just due to minimal branding or a lack of artistic elements, or also knowing what's on display, like exhibitions and public programs. It also doesn't help that it's in a park with other competing museums. Furthermore, its banners and logos illustrated in this diagram can be difficult to see from the street level or approaching from the side. These challenges are addressed, in our belief, at the Met, which features a bold logo, colorful banners, and artworks at a lower level on the facade. They've also introduced freestanding digital kiosks, which can capture pedestrian sight lines from the street as visitors approach the building laterally. Another common barrier with arriving to the museum is the entry area. Plazas oftentimes lack seating and shade and can be unwelcoming for visitors who need a place to gather and rest before and after visits. The Met also serves as an example here of how a plaza can be turned into a welcoming destination with comfortable seating, fountains, planters, and shade that encourage visitors to gather, rest, and dine. Okay, so we've made it through the front doors of the building. Now we're going to take you into the lobby and what we'll encounter there. In many museums, as soon as you enter, you're confronted by security guards and sometimes metal detectors. In our view, American standards of post-9/11 security contradict the design trend of transparency that Joel mentioned earlier to be welcoming to the public. We've learned that when security is an architectural afterthought, this can pose an uncomfortable situation, especially for people of color, trans people, and immigrants who may have fraught relationships with security and policing, as well as the guards themselves who can be put into uncomfortable situations while enforcing the museum's code of conduct. The next barrier common to many museums is the design of the reception desk itself. We'll zoom into one example at the Queens Museum. First is visibility and location. Reception desks can sometimes be too far from entrances, or in the case of Queens, can be freestanding and poorly marked, resulting in visitors walking straight past it. Second is ergonomics. Desks can be too tall or feature flat fronts, which presents a barrier to wheelchair users, children, and little people who can't see or reach across the counter. And third, visual and acoustic barriers like computer monitors or hygiene shields can restrict communication, especially for hard of hearing individuals or deaf people who rely on lip reading. Another barrier that we encounter is information and wayfinding. Reception areas bear a burden of conveying ideas about logistics, hours, admission, codes of conduct, as well as what's on, exhibitions, programs, etc. This all takes place in a very compressed space, verbally, through analog means, as well as digital means, and can create a series of issues. Staff can be overwhelmed with too much information to relay in one place. The museums increasingly rely on QR codes and digital content, which can be pose barriers for older adults or people without smartphones who require analog options. Language with information oftentimes only in English, as well as access offerings. Many visitors are reluctant to visit in the first place because even if the museum does provide access equipment, it might not be obvious that this exists or where to find it once you arrive. To address some of these barriers, we recommend desks that can be multi-height with rounded edges for safety and have an overhanging counter. These ergonomic interventions can aid sight lines, leg room, and ranges of motion for wheelchair users, little people, and children. Our toolkit also recommends that reception can be activated as a hub for information in both analog and digital formats. Content can be large font, high contrast, in Braille, offer audio descriptions and ASL welcome videos. Multilingual information can be created based on which languages in one's community are most commonly spoken. Access offerings can be made visible. One idea illustrated here is an access shelf, where you can build into the reception desk equipment like noise-canceling headphones, assistive listening devices, or information on seating and wheelchair rentals. And instrumental to this idea is that the visit really begins at home, conveying information in advance, like social narratives that can provide a visual walkthrough for visitors to anticipate the museum experience, which we've learned is especially useful to autistic visitors. So now we've passed through reception, let's navigate the museum's interior. Starting with vertical circulation, this consists of level changes, be it stairs, steps, ramps, or elevators. Historically, art museums have featured a monumental so-called grand stair that ascends to an upper level with top-lit galleries of paintings. In our view, this tradition celebrates ableism by centralizing a feature inaccessible to wheelchair, stroller users, as well as many others, like low vision people who can struggle with detecting stair edges. Additionally, elevators are poorly marked and located far away, which disrupts the visitor experience for those who need it. Ramps can be too steep and cause bottlenecks and detours. As a rule of thumb, we recommend designing vertical circulation to promote sharing, so the maximum number of visitors can have a shared experience. Consolidating vertical circulation elements in a stacked core in a visible location, preferably near the main entrance, is important because we've learned that predictability is key here. And for all level changes, we recommend multi-height handrails in order to accommodate people in different wheelchair sizes, as well as children. When it comes to wayfinding, hallways and corridors can be narrow, poorly lit, result in dead ends, and lack clear directional signage. Here we recommend considering multiple sight lines and viewing heights, and working with graphic designers to prioritize legibility by using large fonts and high contrast colors, as well as Braille options. We also think that conventional signage can be taken one step further with environmental graphics and multisensory wayfinding. This can include applying graphics directly to walls and floor surfaces, using color and tactile elements to help everyone safely navigate the museum. Tactile paving and floor tracks can aid visitors who use white canes, as well as embedding Braille onto wall surfaces. Next, we'll move on to wellness, which we use to describe taking care of oneself as well as others. Some of you may be familiar with our Stalled initiative, which for the past 8 years has worked on creating inclusive restrooms, and we'll zoom through some of these key findings now, which we think are applicable to museums. Wellness really begins here. I hope at this point we're all familiar with the challenges posed by gendered restrooms, which separate people into 2 categories, cis men and women, to perform 3 activities: washing, grooming, and toileting. We know that this restroom design excludes trans and non-binary people, as well as parents and caregivers accompanying people of other genders. However, restrooms also don't meet the needs of many other user groups, including wheelchair users who can't access fixtures like pictured here, Muslim toilet etiquette, and people with medical needs like injections or colostomy bags. Restroom wayfinding can also pose the same challenge as mentioned previously, exacerbated by confusing anthropomorphic pictograms that perpetuate the gender binary. We've developed a stalled inclusive restroom prototype that eliminates this binary and instead treats the restroom as a single open space with multiple entries. This can address common challenges of inaccessible entrances, cramped corridors, and dead ends. This prototype features 3 zones: a space for resting and waiting for companions, a communal washing and grooming station with multi-height counters and high-contrast fixtures, as well as toilet stalls with full-height partitions at different sizes, including a fully private caregiving room that allows those who need total privacy to have this option. For signage, we recommend simply calling it a restroom, or better yet, using universal fixture icons like toilets and sinks, which point attention to the activities that take place rather than sorting people into gendered categories. And if any of you have used the restrooms outside, you'll see this in practice. We think benefits include increased safety, with more eyes on the street to deter harassment, and non-binary people like myself are no longer forced to make a choice that doesn't align with our gender identity. We also recommend supplementing restrooms with additional spaces like a lactation room, a visually and acoustically private place with a sink, dry counter for baby changing, mini fridge, and comfortable chair for nursing and pumping. We recommend a sensory room, a place to rest and recharge for people experiencing overstimulation, including children and people on the spectrum. We recommend soft, tactile, acoustic walls and diffused lighting, providing a quiet, glare-free interior. Another important aspect of wellness, religious and spiritual activity, is oftentimes not accommodated whatsoever. We recommend an interfaith space for religious and spiritual individuals to conduct prayer and meditation. Neutral aesthetics like quiet acoustics, filtered light, rounded walls, as well as practical fixtures like an ablution bench and foot shower for Muslim pre-prayer washing, sink, shoe racks, and storage chest with different religious materials can contribute to creating this interfaith space. Finally, while we're partial to the restroom prototype shown earlier, we recommend that museums create a distribution plan that might offer all three types of restrooms depending on privacy needs. We recommend distributing restrooms in predictable location, perhaps consolidated with the stacked vertical circulation elements mentioned earlier and available at short travel distances. Another aspect of wellness is seating. This is the #1 complaint we hear, a lack of comfortable places for diverse visitors to queue, sit, rest, and escape overstimulation. Like with restrooms, we recommend a distribution plan that can activate different areas of the museum with different kinds of comfortable seating. One way is to activate hallways and corridors that might be unused as a place for visitors to rest and engage with museum content. Ergonomic considerations for seating include multi-height and double-sided options, as well as armrests, footrests, back support, and slots so that wheelchair users can allow for side-by-side conversations. We recommend using high contrast colors to aid conversations in ASL, as well as lightweight modular products that can be reconfigured by staff and sometimes patrons. Lastly, we'll end with atmosphere. Common barriers associated with atmosphere include the following: natural and electric lighting that can result in spaces too dark for low vision individuals, or flickering that can overstimulate autistic people. Acoustics generated by hard white cube walls that create echo exacerbated by amplified artwork, which can be especially disorienting for hard of hearing individuals or people with sensory sensitivities. And lastly, materials. While this is a more qualitative barrier, we heard many complaints of museums' clinical building materials being compared to hospitals or airports. White walls, stainless steel fixtures, and concrete, which can create an uninviting atmosphere for culturally and linguistically diverse visitors. For lighting, louvers and shade can create glare-free spaces that balance natural and electric light, and sound-absorptive wall and ceiling materials can address acoustics by creating quiet, non-reverberant spaces. To our surprise, though our thinking about accessibility began with more functional questions like the previous slide, our engagement with the Access cohort revealed a much larger conversation about how materials might make the museum more welcoming for everyone. So our findings question the accepted material palette of the contemporary museum, instead recommending fixtures, furniture, and equipment that can enliven white walls and gray concrete floors, using color, texture, and pattern to create an inviting atmosphere. Finally, an idea from the Access cohort was working with multicultural artists from the museum's neighborhood to develop patterns and textiles that could clad furniture or enliven blank wall spaces. We also received feedback that visitors want greenery, with the caveat that managing plants and their pests can be challenging. So tonight's presentation is really just the tip of the iceberg, a work in progress. I'm going to invite Joel back on for a few slides. We realize that we're really part of a greater constellation of people working on these issues, which is why we're continuing to assemble architects, museum professionals, artists, and scholars to build upon this work. So the result will be a public report published by the Architectural League later this year, and we'd love for you to send us your input about how you're tackling this work. Tonight's event is part of this process. In 2022, we received a grant that allowed us to share our findings with our partner museums from Cooper Hewitt, Whitney, and the Brooklyn Museum, all of whom are here tonight, and we asked them for feedback. So with that, I'll pass it back to Joel to outline some of the challenges of implementing this work before we move on to the panel discussion. Thanks.
So just 4 or 5 more slides. Okay, we're almost done. But as Seb indicated, the MIXmuseum Toolkit is a work in progress that needs more input from you, and we really do invite many people of you in the audience who are working on this problem to add to our archive. But also, not only are we developing, let's call it the content, the guidelines that we described, but also, as important, is the inclusive design process itself. In other words, the process that we use to generate the content. And so based on our experience at MIXdesign, making inclusive museums poses significant challenges as well as opportunities. And we want to conclude by sharing some of them with you. So first is engagement. Organizing and conducting stakeholder and community engagement can be time-consuming and expensive. It requires allocating additional resources, as in staff and financial resources, to create and conduct engagement tools like we described, surveys, programs, and workshops. And in addition, that they can impact and extend project schedules. In addition, recruiting participants who represent what we aim for, an intersectional sampling of visitors, often the ones who don't come, as Seb pointed out, requires community outreach efforts. And this is tough and takes time. And once they have signed on, it's important to develop a transparent process that, for lack of a better word, manages expectations. The process, the co-design process can backfire, right? Unless we found that you make clear to participants that practical constraints like budgets and project schedules and even limited footprints won't make it possible to follow through on all of their recommendations. Implementation. Design recommendations alone aren't enough. I think Seb already pointed that out. But their implementation depends on changing, for lack of a better word, institutional culture, the DNA of art museums, so that inclusive design values are integrated into the very fabric of museums' organizational, communication, and governance structures. We have learned that in many cases, curators and the staff entrusted to oversee DEA policies that shape the visitor experience can be siloed and don't always see eye to eye, and kind of maybe represented in this institutional chart. Moving forward, we feel, and I think our colleagues feel, that museums need to adopt strategies for fostering communication between administrators, curators, and educators, as well as, and this is what we found from this is what I think has been the most rewarding part of the process, at least for me, is engaging people who no one engages, like the people who work at the front desk, security guards, and even the maintenance people who clean the bathrooms that we've described, okay? And to do this in a way to facilitate the development and implementation of viable and sustainable inclusive design inventions. Otherwise, it's impossible. And in addition, it goes without saying that implementation requires development, raising funds to finance the process and ultimately to construct these capital improvement projects. But I think the most, well, I shouldn't rank, but at least for myself, the challenge I'm most interested in recently, and I would say partly because of my friend David Gisson, who is in the audience and just came out with an amazing book you all should run out and buy, The Architecture of Disability. But many, not just David, argue that inclusive design risks perpetuating a functionalist mindset, or what Jacob referred to, a medical model of disability that creates so-called fixes, accommodations that allow people with impairments to behave as close to normal, right, and have equal access to public institutions like museums. So I think, as Jacob already pointed out, we need to move forward and reimagine museum accessibility in a way that aligns with a social model of disability, one of whose goals is to design built environments that validate and that celebrate not only disability, but the many different ways of being different that constitute the sum total of each of our individual various core identities. And so, for example, we can learn from people with different physical, sensory, and social abilities, as well as people from different ethnic and religious communities. And I think this is important. People who engage with built environments like museums, using faculties, senses, and bringing customs and even rituals that we all can learn from. So for example, we might apply an insight about sightlines that we learned from conducting a co-design workshop again at Queen's with wheelchair users. Rather than display pictures, they said, at, let's say, a lower standard, because at the beginning they were critical of the higher sightlines that made people in wheelchairs have to raise their heads. And one woman said, it was so moving to me, you know, you can have all the ramps in the world, we were talking about ramps, but I'm not going to come to this museum because the height line of the picture makes it clear that you're not thinking, I don't belong here. Okay, and so what they recommended in the end was a variety of sightlines that would ask everyone, no matter their ability, their size, or their stature, to encounter art from different visual perspectives. And this idea was visualized by some Yale graduate students for a proposal to reinstall antique busts, which are now at a kind of average male height, at varying heights, which would actually mirror the busts of these people being portrayed of different ages and abilities. In addition, incorporating the fresh perspectives of non-normative users will enable us to offer an alternative to what I began to talk about, what I was talking about in the introduction. This tradition of the museum as a Western ocular-centric place, a place where spectators expect to look at works of visual art. Instead, these fresh perspectives will enable us to reimagine museums as multisensory environments, places that welcome each one of us to encounter works of art using multiple sense perceptions, sight, hearing, and touch. And so in this way, participatory design will allow us to build alliances, okay? Will allow us to build, on the work of artists, again, who at least since even before the 1960s, have used sound, video, multimedia, performance to create artworks that expand our sensory horizons. And finally, you know, we believe, and I hope you too will be convinced, that inclusive design promises to be a catalyst for creativity. It's not only about functional access. Bringing the perspectives of those typically consigned to the margins to the center of the design process will allow us to build alliances so that museum stakeholders and designers and users can generate innovative design ideas that we think can enhance almost everyone's experience of museums and public institutions and in the end public space. So thank you very much. And I want to invite our panelists now up on the stage for what I'm sure will be an exciting discussion moderated by Ignacio Galan.
Yes, we at Cooper Hube, when I arrived, one of the projects that I first encountered, actually, I've only been at the museum for a year and a half, and that was at the tail end of MIX's project with Cooper Hewitt, which was an expansion of the style project that they just described. So I think both of you should actually talk about how the process was. I was not there, but I know that you engaged with my staff and with my team in a variety of workshops and conversations. And I know that when I arrived to Cooper Hewitt, I already found a fertile ground that needed no convincing. So I think I was lucky in that regard of arriving to an institution that doesn't need that convincing. There's still a lot of people that need to be convinced, but I know that where I am, there were already initiatives that had taken place, and yours was one of them. And your project was also featured at the time, a little later on, in an exhibition that we had at Cooper Hewitt that was called Designing Peace. And it spoke about the variety of ways in which design plays a role in creating or facilitating peaceful interactions. And the style project was actually an example of how one creates peaceful spaces and spaces of inclusion within an institution. And it was presented alongside a variety of other projects that the curators and placements put together for that show. So it was good to see it included in that context. And I would say that there's a great interest in our museum. For those of you who know it, we inhabit a historic mansion that has its own set of challenges, and there are many, and there are many to tackle. So we're taking a more holistic approach right now. All of those are, which include a lot of the ones that have been described by Seth. by Joel. From an entrance, I mean, we sit on Fifth Avenue on 90th Street on a gilded mansion with a gated, enormous, giant iron gate. So need I say more of all the work that is ahead of us and that we need to do. I'm particularly very interested in applying some of the specifics that you described in our entryway. We're looking at what we call our onboarding experience. I know that a lot of that thinking comes from the workshops that you did there. It's not new. They're not new ideas, and we're looking very closely at how we change the onboarding experience at the museum. We suffer from that problem. People don't know sometimes who we are, that we are a Smithsonian, that we're going to talk about design in this space. So I think there's a lot that we learned from the toolkit. There's a lot that I learned from the toolkit when I arrived to understand the challenges of the space. And there's lots to be done. And I think there's, I think that, again, the willingness is there, but I'm very interested in the implementations that are things that you refer to, and I hope we deepen the conversation in that part of things as well later on.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kiana Hendrick from the Brooklyn Museum, DEIA director there. How many of y'all have been to the Brooklyn Museum? Oh, ooh, yes. I love that. Okay, that's great. Well, welcome. Come back. As you can see from the slides, and I'm sure from your own experience, you know that we are a 200-year-old institution. We're actually about to celebrate our 200th anniversary in the fall, and a very old building, but one in which we have an incredibly diverse staff that is also thinking about how do we support being a welcoming space for belonging to an incredibly diverse group of community members, right? Artists, donors, and so forth. And that is an ongoing challenge, but one that we like to show up and step in for the moment for. So it was really perfect timing, I think, to step into our relationship with you. I know when I got the follow-up call from my colleague, Allison Day, who has been a 20-year, I would say, advocate for accessibility and inclusion in our institution, and not coming from a place of, executive leadership, but coming from a place of real community comradeship. That, hey, wait, I built this relationship with MIXmuseum and working with Seb. It was so important at that time in our COVID crisis, right? To not only think about how are we actually walking in our values. We had been actually updating our values from an equity lens, but now how do we synthesize and really think about the intersectional or the multidimensional aspects of accessibility that we really say that we're supporting. So hearing those guidelines and bringing together team members from all different departments was really a level setting process for us in many ways, because there was a lot of passion about that, about the work happening across the museum, but really in silos. And of course, in the midst of COVID, we're also working remotely and hybrid, and there's that division that many of you who have jobs might have also experienced as well, right? So it was actually one of the first large meetings we had as a group in person that was that planning meeting, and so we were really excited to have that back. And I would say, in terms of your question, Ignacio, about the impact of that is that it gave us gave different team members some new vocabulary to use, right? It also helped us clarify our internal vocabulary. Like, what do we actually mean when we say access at Brooklyn Museum? That's very different maybe from access at Queens or Whitney or Cooper Hewitt. And to write that down for ourselves, right? And to go even further and say, let's take an informal inventory of what we have going on now in this space. How does it align or compare with what they've presented us in the research they presented? But also, what does it mean for that to be the Brooklyn way, right? What would it look like here? And how can we dream up something better than what we're doing now? The impact of that, it was a real ripple effect. Since then, we've done an audit with another accessibility organization and partner. We've set out a 12-point plan for the next 2 fiscal years I'm glad to say we're 25% through hitting all those markers, from environmental upgrades, like updating the parking lot spaces and things like that, visibility, to really getting a plan together for fundraising around this and sharing that wish list of things that we know need to be changed in the building with our development staff members as such. So I'll stop there. I've talked a lot, but pass it on to you.
Hi, I'm Sally Talent. I'm director of the Queen's Museum. I think Joel, I remember sitting in my office talking for hours with you when we first met. Maybe it was pre-pandemic, maybe 2019, something like this. And that's where this project began for us and where this conversation began. But right from the beginning, a lot of the questions we ask at the Queen's Museum are about, how do we remove physical and attitudinal barriers for people to engage at whatever level they choose with both our programs and the building, and how can we make sure that we're not inadvertently putting barriers in the way of people engaging with the work that we do. And it's been such a privilege, the process that you saw described over the last 2 years, to work together with an incredible team of people. So facilitated Zeb in the most excellent way. I cannot tell you what an amazing, thoughtful, caring, careful facilitator Zeb is, and I think without you, there's a kind of magic that you did with so many people. But many of the people who really did the work are in the room this evening, and I want to acknowledge and thank them. So I can see Kathleen right here, Deb and Tyler there, our colleagues at Queen's Community House, who without them we wouldn't even have had access to the community. Gia, Enriches are there. I think some of our access cohort are also here, and also want to thank Justin Singleton, who's our front of house manager, and Kimar de Lejeune, who had those meetings every 2 weeks, and we have learned so much from you. And our work in terms of understanding the barriers that people encounter, not only to get into the building, and we know the Queen's Museum is not right next to the subway like your museum, and I'm very jealous of that. And I know everyone wants me to provide a bus, which we cannot do. But it's interesting to kind of hear and gain the feedback about not only the work we choose to present in the space, how we present that work, the physical challenges that the architecture that we navigate, that we occupy, presents us with, and then the kind of many other kind of social and attitudinal barriers that people encounter. I think we have a much better understanding of what we need to do to change, and we have not done those changes. I would say it's been wonderful to learn more about what we need to do, but actually doing that is the step and the place that we're in now. So I'm very grateful as well that actually one of the MIXdesign team, Brenna, left MIXdesign but joined Levenbeth, who are also here, who are the architects working on our capital project and are bringing a lot of that learning into all of the questions.
I don't want to talk too much, but I just wanted to say that actually what we've learned is so much. We've learned our building is problematic. Getting to our building is problematic. We inadvertently create inaccessible programming because of the culture that we perpetuate.
And we need to challenge ourselves and think about how we can do that better. And I think that change is even harder to implement. This is also what I've learned. Change is even harder to implement than we know. And we're relearning the same things all the time. Our team keeps changing as well, so there's a knowledge that needs to be passed down. But I hope that we can, learn from some of your recommendations and make changes, physical changes, and hopefully attitudinal changes that will improve the experience of visiting the Queen's Museum. So it's an ongoing process. I also see one of our trustees is here, and I'm really happy that our trustees are very engaged in this process as well, along with everyone else.
Hi, I'm Daima Simmons. I'm the Director of Social Impact at the Whitney Museum. I feel pretty aligned with a lot of what's already been said, but I'll also add, I think the workshop that you all did at the Whitney did have a huge impact, and I think it's continuing to have a huge impact. I think, as Joel mentioned earlier, just having so many people from different departments who are maybe not typically involved in conversations about accessibility was, I think, incredible. And there was a survey that you all gave to all staff to talk about their perspectives on visitorship and how folks were experiencing the museum. And it was really amazing to hear everyone's perspectives and have that represented in that way, I think, for the first time. And I think people felt their voices were valued and their perspectives were valued, so I think that did a lot. And in our workshop, there were senior leaders from all different parts of the museum, which was also, I think, really powerful for them to be a part of that conversation. And I think often when we're having conversations around accessibility, there's the pressure of an exhibition that's coming, and it's like we have to make decisions right away. And I think to be able to have this conversation without specific time pressures of like, we have to do this, I think that was really freeing for a lot of people. I think the other thing that the workshop highlighted was that there were some things that staff didn't know about the museum. Like there is a space in the museum where visitors can go that's like a multi-purpose room for whether it be chest feeding or prayer. Like I would say 75% of the staff didn't know that in the workshop room. So we were like, oh really, where is that? So I think that it highlighted that there are some internal communication issues. We actually have like a new internal staff comms person, I think as a result of this, but also, result of other things. So I think it just emphasized to us that it's so important to have multiple people from multiple departments a part of this conversation, so that they feel like their perspective is valued. We also have a new cross-department working group that's specifically focused on accessibility, and we have shared projects where folks have different projects that they're working on from their different departments, so that it's not just the access area that I help oversee, but it's facilities, it's visitor services, because really they are the experts in some of these different areas.
Great. I had prepared 4 questions, but I want to be mindful of the time, since we're a talkative group, I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience. I'm going to jump to the last question that I had shared with you, and relates to the kind of fascinating history with which Joel started, acknowledging how the inclusion of diverse body minds and different groups into the galleries has always involved some sort of disruption of hegemonic behaviors and norms. And yet many strategies implemented to facilitate access in their stated goal of seeking to benefit everyone, regardless of disability, religion, race, and class, many times contribute to neutralize difference and assimilate these groups within those very hegemonic frameworks. Even more, they might even mystify the conflicts that are at stake between those different groups with their intersectional experience and the frameworks that I'm referring to. And this is something that disability activists and scholars such as Emihan Rai and the whole discourse of critical access has been while simultaneously celebrating and foregrounding the alternative ways of navigating spaces, apprehending work, and behaving, instead of neutralizing those differences. How are your institutions, I'd ask, discussing both the conflicts and opportunities that might result from expanding the diversity of your audiences? And even more, how can we think of museums as platforms to politicize access rather than to neutralize it? And this would involve bringing to the fore the conflicts that and the ongoing forms of oppression of those groups that we are trying to with these strategies to bring together. I said it was a more difficult question, but I sent it in advance. All my questions were shared so that we could all prepare.
I don't mind attempting to go at it, though there's so many parts to your comment. Let's see. I think what we're talking about here is about how we treat people, ultimately, right? And how we treat people has a lot to do with the spaces that people inhabit. But there's a variety of ways to engage in the work. One is through the design of spaces, but I would argue that it's not the only way. The other way is to try and deepen the relationships that we have with our audiences as well. And then I think there's a third way that's been alluded by my colleagues that I know comes a lot in conversation when I speak to my colleague Kirsten too, is how we all take this role in our institutions, and it's not just given to one single person, but how you spread the load of how you treat people through your staff members as well, so that it's everybody's job and not the director's job or not the leading inclusion in the colleague's job, but everybody's job. And I think there's challenges to all those three. My specific challenges, since you mentioned politicizing spaces, I work for the federal government. There's a lot of things that I can and that I cannot do. I have my personal views and my personal ways of treating people, which will never change. But at the same time, I'm in a building that we're one of 21 Smithsonians. We follow federal rules. And I think all the time about the current political climate of the country and what that means, and the lack of, we don't have a great agreement on even definitions of what inclusion or accessibility should be. And I encounter this problem constantly, because if I have to defend one of these issues as a political issue, I can be immediately neutralized because I am not allowed to do that. So there's a great need, I think, for having shared definitions of what inclusion and what the inclusion work and accessibility work and equity work means. Language is crucially important in this whole, I'm going to call it battle, because it can be a battle, as we heard from our colleagues and our interpreters at the beginning, and even how we call things matters. So if we don't have a basis of definitions for the work, I need that, because if not, what we would need is shared values, right? I can fight for a shared value that is understood to be a right for all, and that is not politicized. So as much as my internal me, Maria, who I am, where I come from, is I'm going to say it, a political activist, because it's how I think of myself as, I have to wear this other sort of hat of how to find the values that are common to everybody so that they don't appear to be partisan in my institution. And that's a really, really difficult challenge to do. And but I think it makes me personally think harder about it, and my colleagues think harder about it. It also puts a lot of pressures on us as we try to do this work. So so I think there's a great need to define, which you do so well, and it's what's in the toolkit as well. I think you mentioned it as well. You provided a language, and we need these definitions, and we need everybody to agree with these definitions, because otherwise they're in question, and we can't be in that space.
Thank you for articulating that. I think it's really helpful because, like you, I occupy a city building. So we have responsibilities and limitations on what we can and can't do. And I think, but when it comes to access, I think we can make choices about who we choose to exclude. And I think that's something we have to ask ourselves. Who don't we want to come into our buildings? If the answer to that is we want everyone to come into our buildings, then why doesn't it feel like that to everyone? And how can we work towards making our buildings more inclusive? I think the hardest thing in my experience of trying to do this work for my entire career, is that people unlearning the ways in which they do their job across departments is like very difficult. And that is, and I think the taxonomy of museums, the history of museums, which you referred to, Joel, the way in which people have learnt to create exhibitionary practice, the separation between education and exhibitions, and the lack of clear conversation across departments, and the fact that people are under-resourced, don't have enough time, are just trying to do their job and want to get the exhibitions up with tight budgets, mean that it's very hard for people to change, and they revert to methodologies and practices that are maybe needing to change but require time and effort to change. So I think the hardest thing is to insert that process of change into the way that you think about your work, and also to enable your staff to do that when they're already wildly under-resourced and already kind of exhausted by the work they're trying to do, and in some cases trying to do what they believe to be the best job because that's how they've been trained, but actually you're telling them not to do it like that anymore. So it's a whole, there's a lot of unlearning needed in all of this.
This was a hard question. You sent it out ahead of time, and I've been thinking about this all week and what part of it to kind of jump into. And I think, you know, I keep resting on this thing of, I'm glad you used the word unlearning, but also thinking about how do we shift our expectations for how we want people to show up? You know, it's like, oh, I want you all to be here and setting up properly and smiling at me. No one's smiling at me right now. What's going on? To tell me that you're interested, right? Well, that might not be how you show me that you're interested. And that might not be the way, you know, you might not engage with the work in, you know, I used to be a museum educator, with the museum walk, with your hands behind your back and all that stuff. But also, how do we expand the way we want people to show up in their work every day? And so when I ask that question of like shifting our expectations for others, how do we start that internally? Like when I look at our DEI plan and a lot of our efforts, my colleague here, Hannah, and I have been working in DEI to really think about the HR aspects of it. What do those inclusion guidelines look like for us as a team? Because if we can't actually set them up for ourselves, how are we supposed to set them up for anybody else? And if we can build an internal culture around them where, I'll give you an example. We talked about this, folks having accommodations for meetings where maybe they can knit if they need to focus. And it's like, well, do we need to have an accommodation for that? Or maybe we should just shift our meeting policy and actually create an inclusion policy or an accessibility policy that just says this is what the meeting protocols are, because we haven't had one before. And that might help us think differently about each other, and then in turn, when visitors get there, do we think differently about them or the artists we work with or so forth? And I mean, it might seem very like a little different than what you're thinking about in terms of like the built environment, but I think it's about the culture of that built environment, the culture of the people who come in it that can also help us make those plans and think more expansively for the capital planning that we're doing in the next few years as well, because you get to kind of see people behave in the unprofessional ways. Like, what does professional unprofessionalism look like to get the job done, you know? And I know I keep coming back to COVID, but I feel like that this learning process through this pandemic has been a great example of that, right? We saw people doing things and still getting to those outcomes in methods that weren't what we expected them, the ways we expected them to get there, but they still kind of got there. Maybe not without loss. I'm not saying that was an okay experience for any of us to have, but it could have been culture shifting. I say that intentionally. It could have been culture shifting because we're reverting back in a way that really helps us think about just new worlds or new ways of being within our institutions. So.
I think the Whitney, as you know, we've been in our new building for almost 10 years, so that's still pretty new. And it's interesting. I think that there was this feeling, at least like from my perspective, of like, oh, like everything is great, like it's ADA compliant, like it's all these things because it's so new, so we don't necessarily have the same challenges as some of the other folks do with their institutions. But I think that really worked against us because I think it was like, okay, we're done for at least a while. Whereas I think it's really obvious now that like getting that visitor feedback and having that reflection constantly is so important. It needs to be built into our ways of working, ways of thinking about how to improve. And I think especially as we hope to have a more diverse audience in a lot of different ways, I think in addition to the Whitney wanting to be accessible to folks with a wide range of disabilities, we also have a goal of being bilingual, within the next few years. Like increasingly our exhibitions are in English and Spanish. And I think sometimes those things are seen as competing or conflicting. And I think that there is a shift in how we think about the possibilities that needs to happen. I think it's like, well, I haven't seen it done like this. And, I think at the same time, it's like, we want to be minimalist. Like, we don't want all this stuff. So I think that just imagining new ways of being in a museum, of what a museum can look like, is so necessary. And I think that's what we started to explore with the MIXdesign team, which was exciting. So yeah, I just think having that constant feedback and being willing to listen and integrate, even if it's like we can't integrate right away, but just with that goal, I think is really important.
Great. So, yes, it's your time. There's a quick question here.
Testing. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much to Joel, Seb, and the rest of the lovely panel for speaking at large about your experiences. I'm a curator and also a current graduate student in environmental design at Yale. Joel may know me from somewhere on campus. And I have a question that has to do with how the built environment inflect upon the unbuilt and the kind of effective environment. And I want to ask a lot about the culture of understanding accessibility, because I think it is maybe partly alluded to in Joel and Seb's presentations to talk about how even though we are looking at the specificities of design as a material process here in adapting the built environment, many times it also creates this psychic terrain and also this kind of discursive terrain. And I'm really curious as to then how has this understanding of accessibility maybe also filtered into larger considerations of programming, membership, community development, even maybe curatorial projects. And I'm just really curious as to, for example, when we think about the implementations done to make existing structures that much more accessible, are you also then thinking about it in situ of the kind of immaterial missions of what your institutions are trying to achieve? Sorry, I don't have punctuation.
I think thank you for your question. I think you're alluding to as well something that I think about, which is through change and how that really starts to seep into our behavior in the space and the projects that we produce and the outcomes of that. And I'm thinking of a project that's coming up at the Cooper Hewitt at the end of the year. We do our design triennials, and they usually take on huge topics that we consider to be urgent for discussion. Past triennials have covered topics like nature or beauty. The theme that's coming up has a lot to do, I think, with some of the conversations that we're having, because it has to do with belonging and the sense of belonging and the role of design in making you feel like you belong in a space. So I think it's huge that curatorially that theme is coming into the output that we put. Again, because sometimes I have to forget and like stop thinking about my historic Carnegie Mansion, and because I can implement change much faster, so can my curators and my programmers if through the content that we do, because we have so many barriers to the implementation. So actually what you're suggesting is a much more effective, in my opinion, much more responsive way to current conversations that also shows a true acceptance of those principles if you're showing them through your work. So I think we should aspire to seeing that sort of like seepage into the content, and otherwise we're not doing it right.
Okay, it is on. Just didn't have a light on it, so I was like, I just want to say very quickly, because I know it takes time to answer these, but I think what you said, Joel, which is the basic politics, nothing about us without us. I think it's also important to look at the programming. So we've benefited at the Queen's Museum over the last few years of having incredible exhibitions of that centre artists like Christine Sung Kim, who is a very political, very brilliant, wonderful deaf artist. And through working with her, we all learn a lot about how better to work with people with the deaf community, and we actually did a fantastic ASL slam, and like it was just so exciting to have more diversity in our audience. And then currently, for the last year, we've one of our Jerome Fellows who get a studio on site at the museum for a year. It's a very, very competitive process, and we selected Emily Glosseau, who's an amazing artist, and her show just opened at the museum, and she is blind and makes work about her interspecies relationship with her guide dog, London. But actually having her on site at the museum with us for an entire year made us really think about how, not just accommodations, but how we better need to think about, you know, people with low vision and people who are blind and the barriers they encounter. Simple things like tactile, what do you call it? Tactile wayfinding. Like we use tape, but like when we talk about our new capital project, really understanding we have to think about the flooring, and we can do very simple things that are much more inclusive. And then, you know, offering touch tours as a kind of standard thing that we will do into the future in ASL. So I think being more bold about thinking about whose culture do we represent in our museums. So this is not about democratizing culture, this is about cultural democracy. So not about teaching people top down how to appreciate culture, but actually thinking about whose culture do we appreciate in the first place and presenting it from bottom up, so it's a more inclusive program.
Yeah, I think you asked a question about like how the built environment is impacted the programs. I actually, at Brooklyn Museum, it's almost been reversed, right? So we think about those relationships that have come often from education and front of house staff members who are doing these programs, and then that call for need has also like impacted the built environment. Oh, you got me back? Okay. As you know, our building was not necessarily built with this type of inclusivity in mind. So, a great example is like a Dapper Q. Dapper Q is an organization that does thinks about the intersection of fashion and gender representation or gender expression, and having a Dapper Q annual fashion show and not having a wheelchair accessible staging is a problem at Brooklyn Museum. So now it's like, okay, does DEIA's budget accommodate for that? Does public programs, how are we going to pull our money together? Is it coming from the director's office? Because we've got this relationship with folks and we've got to show up for them in the ways that we need to. So, but it also brings in my architect and like, wait, what other impositions is this going to create if we have this temporary structure there? Is it going to, how can we get us more in conversation? How can we build this into maybe some capital planning that we have coming up? But also, how are we going to stand on business and make sure that the budget, the values are in the budget lines, right? So that we make sure we show up and we pay for the things that we need to when we can.
Hi. I just wanted to ask one question. You've spoken also about culture and deepening relationships internally outside of the architectural questions that we're raising here. But I was wondering if you've considered something rather simple, just the value of those that you, the diversity of your audience, and to see themselves represented as competent staff members, and that you may want to consider, or if you have considered, engaging persons of diverse, people with disabilities in your staff, because I think that that's an incredibly powerful thing that just in subtle and not so subtle ways will change the attitudes and the things that you're trying to strive for. So I just wanted to say you may want to consider that.
I'll add also to our boards to the list that you just had, and I think that's important, and representation is important in that sense, because a lot of these experiences come from personal experiences, and if those are not represented, I would argue again, like, we're not doing the job. In our board, for example, we're very lucky to have Victor Calisi. He's the former commissioner for accessibility for the Office of the Mayor in New York City, who you might know, and really incredible person at so many levels, and he calls us out. He calls us out, and he helps us also when we're trying to push forward these initiatives. So again, it's important at the level of representation of all the areas that you mentioned, but like, if you don't have it at the board, you're also not going to convince funders. So it starts there as well.
Yeah, I'll just agree that I think it's super important, and thank you for that question, to have folks with disabilities on staff. I think to have people a part of the conversation from the beginning, rather than, asking people to just consult, or, when something has already been developed or built. It just makes such a difference, and it's something I think within the Whitney we've been trying to do, and not just within the access department, but in all the different departments, working with our HR team to think about that across all the institution. But I think it's really it really has made the institution think about our ways of working that are maybe not so accessible to folks with disabilities, or just this, like, I think rapid, like, this way of working that many of us have in this capitalist society, that's just like about constant production and perfection, and ways of speaking and working. So I think it can be hard for institutions to be reflective and to accept different ways of working, but I think it's so important for us if we really want to change. So thank you for that question.
I kind of want to add a quick end note to that, and that it's the Architectural League. I kind of want to almost resist that question by, just because I've seen so often that it's the staff that are disabled or the staff that are trans that like have to voice these things, and then get this thank you, like, all this burden kind of falls onto people like us, and then we're not paid and we're overextended. I feel like, since this is Architectural League and it's an architectural lecture, the architects need to know this too, so that when the project is happening, they can educate the client if they're not already aware, so it doesn't fall upon some poor staff member that then needs to just fight for their own existence.
Okay. Great.
We also need a discipline and a profession that is more inclusive of disabled architects as well. And I think we need to close. Well, there are actually many questions, but I was told.
Yeah, we want to put them in the space.
Sure. Okay, so for those of you who may not have heard, we're going to have a short period where you can say your question out loud. We're going to put them in the space. We're not going to have responses. And I want to tell you all that we've recorded this presentation and the panel discussion, and this entire event will be available publicly on our website, archleague.org. So this is not the final engagement with these topics, and we welcome you to reach out to us. You can find our information on our website as well to continue these conversations outside of this space. So we're going to have 2 minutes of some questions, and then we're going to close. All right, so can I see those hands again for the questions? I'm going to do one down here, and I see you in the back, and I'm going to come to you. Maybe we'll have those 2 questions, and then we'll close. All right. Can I ask you guys to hand on the mic? Thank you.
Okay, the pressure's on to be super sensible and great here. Thank you, Joel. My name's Celia. I'm a museum architect. I work in this space a lot. And, just the presentation today has been amazing. You've almost presented something that could have been titled "Remaking the Museum," because by interrogating these topics, you're actually kind of uncovering what a museum is meant to be or do. And I wonder whether or not some of your processes are also including things like food equity. You know, when people are making a commitment to come to you from far away, some of you are landed in very affluent neighborhoods, so certain communities you're reaching out to are far. So they're going to spend a lot of time in your space, and they're going to need to maybe bring their own food, or maybe they have certain food needs. So that's something that has a built environment question to it. And also, who are you? Like, how much do people see of what you do and who you are? You know, your conservation spaces, storage, things like that. So it just seems like this is the beginning or part of a really large topic, and I just so appreciate it. Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Christy. I'm an occupational therapist and accessibility and inclusivity consultant. And I want to raise awareness of something that I think is still really important. So we talked a lot about the model, the social model of disability, which talks about how there are barriers in the environment. It's not the disabled person who has the barriers. But what's really interesting is that at the beginning of the event, there was someone sitting next to me who was wearing a respirator mask. And if you know anything about masking, people who wear those kind of masks really, really don't want to get sick because either they themselves have COVID or they love someone, either themselves are disabled or they love someone who is disabled. And within 5 minutes of sitting here and recognizing how packed this event was and how most people are not wearing a mask and people are coughing, they got up frustrated, chuckled at the disability justice comment, and left. This environment today was a barrier for their ability to access an event about accessibility. Events that don't actually happen quite often in New York City, which has so many different museums. So I know we're not answering, but my question is, what are we doing with COVID right now when if you spent 5 minutes within the disability justice community, their number one concern right now is the fact that no one is taking COVID seriously anymore. I am pretty sure that most of the museums that are happening across the city right now have no longer masking policies. They might say they recommend it, we strongly suggest it, but for the first time during COVID, when we had lockdown, non-disabled people suddenly no longer had access to the world, and they flipped out, right? We struggled being home, we struggled being isolated, we struggled not being able to go to the museums. Now, museums are flourishing again, and disabled people still don't have access to these museums, especially people who have compromised immune systems. So I just want to leave that with everyone today. Someone here left because this was not accessible for them. So thank you.
Should you close? Okay, well, that was it. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and have a great night.